Hello everybody, I'm John White. We're honoured to have Kevin Pear join us today on this week's episode of SAMA. Kevin has been a spooky user since 2013. He became interested in Rife and Spooky2 while recovering from a serious case of neurological Lyme and several other tick-borne diseases. In addition to Rife and Spooky2, he utilised many other modalities including IV antibiotics, herbal tinctures, IV zone therapy, prayer, meditation, visualization, and self-hypnosis. Kevin's professional background has included travelling the world as a filmmaker for both the National Park Service and National Geographic television, teaching documentary filmmaking at the college level and giving workshops in filmmaking around the country. In 2008, Kevin decided to follow a deep inner calling to help individuals to effect meaningful change to their inner lives. He assumed at first that he would need to become a psychological counsellor, but after researching the most effective modalities for facilitating positive inner change, he chose to study the clinically proven field of hypnotherapy instead. Kevin has had a practice in transpersonal hypnosis and inner life mentoring since 2010. He is a board-certified consulting hypnotist and is certified in clinical hypnosis through the National Guild of Hypnotists. He is also certified in the transpersonal modality of depth hypnosis through the Depth Hypnosis Institute. He has a deep belief in the power of the mind and spirit to transform emotional and physical health, and finds that hypnosis is an effective way to accomplish this in safe and gentle ways. This sounds so exciting. Kevin's practice is called Inner Alliance Consulting, and his website is www.inneralliance.net. So over to you, Kevin.
Okay, wow. A little nervous here, my first ever webinar, giving a webinar. I'm really honored to be here and to share with you some of the things that I have learned along my path of healing as it relates to the power of the mind and of one's spiritual life in working towards better health. So I'm going to give a little rundown of some of the things I'll talk about during this hour or so that I'll be talking, having this one-sided conversation, and then I'll be open for questions. I'll probably be open for questions even before then. So I welcome them. So what we're going to talk about is I'm going to help you to understand more the profound influence of the mind on the body in both positive and negative ways. Going to familiarize you with the concept of what's called the placebo response, which you've probably heard of, and how it can be a benefit to you. I'll talk about the power of story and storytelling and how you can harness this power for increasing your mental, emotional, and physical well-being. I'll give you an overview of the role of spirituality and how that can be used in healing. I'll also introduce you to the process of hypnosis, what it is, some of the misconceptions about it, what it can be used for, and then finally I'll introduce you to a little bit about the wonderful world of self-hypnosis and how you can use it in your life. Now, I just want to say, because we're covering a lot of information, that this is really an overview. I'm not going to create a hypnotic induction or anything like that in this particular session. So it's mainly just to give you an overview of possibilities and how we are all gifted with this wonderful mind and this wonderful capacity for harnessing the mind, and if we're spiritually inclined, of harnessing our spiritual life, our engagement with that realm, to effect sometimes really quite dramatic healing. So, there there's a tremendous influence that the subconscious mind has on physical health. And fortunately, after so many decades of this being really seen as airy-fairy and everything by the medical establishment, it's now really being recognized that the mind is a very large part of physical healing. And if you leave out the mind and the emotions and that sort of thing, then it makes the healing process a lot more difficult. And conversely, if you get the mind on board with the healing process, then it makes healing so much easier. So it's just, from a practical standpoint, it's extremely efficient. So again, more and more doctors are kind of coming out of the dark and coming out of their prejudice and are saying, wow, yeah, the mind and the body are not separate like we've been taught, and it's actually really important to honor both, and they're actually indivisible. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the positive effects of the mind on the body. So we've all experienced emotions like love and joy and a sense of awe, being awestruck, a real conscious appreciation of beauty, appreciation of those moments where we feel love for another human being or our animal companion, or what. Sometimes it's just a love of an idea, and we're kind of flooded with this emotion, with this feeling. And what is happening is that there's this dramatic release of endorphins and other kinds of, hormones and neurotransmitters and all kinds of good things that flood our body with this feeling of goodness. And when that happens, the healing process commences or intensifies right then. So that's our innate ability. That's something that we're just all, as human beings, we're all gifted with. Release of endorphins, reduction of pain, feeling of well-being. It can help to kind of interrupt obsessive thought, and again, the incitement and the and intensification of the healing process. So, how does this come about? What is it about the mind that is able to create this? Well, that's all a mystery, and nobody really knows. But science has identified something that called the placebo response, which has been the bane of research for many years. And the placebo response was basically where they would set up an experiment and they would give some people sugar pills and other people they would give the real medication. And what they found was that a significant number of people given the sugar pills would actually have a positive reaction as if they were taking the drug. And so it became really difficult, and in some ways it's still really impossible to design experiments that can leave the placebo response entirely out. I mean, that's why they came up with what they call the double-blind studies, but that's not applicable towards everything. But what has happened in more recent years, or very recently actually, is that they've said, well, wait a minute, let's not call the placebo response this dirty thing. Let's actually make use of it. And what is it about the mind that can create this? There's a famous story about a cancer patient who had very dramatic, huge tumor. As far as the doctors were concerned, he was a goner. But he went to this oncologist who really believed in the power of the mind. And he said, look, there's this miraculous drug that just came out, and we're going to give this to you, and we just know that it's going to work. And the guy was really, he really wanted to live. He was really hopeful. So they gave him the drug, and the drug wasn't even that promising in the clinical trials that they give him, but it was just like, there's nothing else we can do. It's not going to hurt. So they gave him the drug, and he had this incredibly positive response, and this gigantic tumor melted away. He got out of bed. He was resuming a normal life. It was seen as kind of a medical miracle. And then further studies, as I said, the drug was not very promising to begin with, but it came into the news that the drug was determined as being essentially ineffective. This guy who had cured himself through his mind unconsciously of this huge tumor, saw this newscast that the drug wasn't effective, and immediately the tumor started growing back. And so within weeks, he was rendered into this state of being in bed again. He was near death, and he went to the oncologist, and the oncologist was desperate to try to keep this guy alive, and he said, and he lied to him, and he said, oh, you know, that was that version of the drug, but now they've come out with this other really super version of the drug, and this stuff really works. And so the guy went home with all of this hope and everything. The tumors melted away. He came back, you know, living a great life. And then somehow news got to him that there wasn't this super drug, that it was, that there was basically no drug that could help him. And within days, he was dead. So all of that was created by his mind, nothing but his mind. So that's the power that we all possess. Another area of what we could call the placebo response is it's really recognized that in our relationship with our doctor, that or whoever our healthcare practitioners are, that the more that they can instill us with a feeling of compassion and caring, you know, that they genuinely care about us, that they're optimistic about our outcome, they're optimistic in our own ability to heal ourselves, they're optimistic in the treatment protocol that they have, that they exude this confidence, and that is actually a significant part of whatever healing that we experience is our mental attitude and our actual relationship with these practitioners. Conversely, doctors who are kind of cold and analytical, who have really poor bedside manners, way too many of them, as we know, they have a much lower rate of healing with their clients because they're terrible at instilling that sense of confidence. They don't recognize that as an important part. It's kind of the old school that it's about coming up with a clinical diagnosis and treating it with drugs, and not recognizing that just by reaching out and touching somebody and saying, I really believe in your ability to heal, and meaning that, can have a dramatic effect. So they've done studies about people who have had positive healings with the placebo response, and they found that there are certain kinds of characteristics that these people have, and I want to share them with you because the more that you can adopt this towards your own healing process, the more successful you may be. So what they found with these people is that there's an ability to believe. There's in the treatment that they're undertaking. And it doesn't mean that no skepticism is allowed. It just means that it needs to be kind of like a translucent kind of skepticism. In other words, it's like, yeah, I'm skeptical, but I'm still open. And so if you have that, or if you're really able to believe in the treatment, then that's something that's very positive. Being open to possibility, being open to, no matter what kind of diagnosis that you get from a medical professional, that you leave open the possibility of your own healing. And if necessary, even more so than them, and that you feel that at a really deep fundamental level. Another is being accepting of healing. We'll talk a little bit about emotional blockages and everything and how that can affect healing. But when you allow yourself to really feel that you are deserving of healing, then that opens the pathways quite a bit more. So if you suffer from a lot of doubt around that, or a lot of being undeserving and that sort of thing, that's a good thing to work on and to heal, because that can stand in the way of healing in a very dramatic way. Having a motivation to heal, having an interest in life and a motivation to heal, and the expectation of a positive income, the expectation of a positive outcome. So just basically, and it doesn't mean that you don't have any doubts. It doesn't mean that you don't have any fear. It's not about suppressing what doesn't agree with that. It just means that your primary mode of being, your primary mental relationship with your healing is one of positive expectancy, and one where you are fully open to, and you're fully accepting of, and you're fully expecting healing, while also being willing to accept and to meet with compassion and realism, to meet whatever arises. So, looking at my list here, let me scroll this up. So, we talked a little bit about the positive effect of the mind on the body, and I just want to talk a little bit about the negative effect of the mind on the body. And this is, primarily, when I say mind on the body, I'm primarily talking about the role of negative emotions and on the physiological functioning of the body. And I'm not talking about getting angry or feeling loneliness or any of those things which are just a normal part of being alive. I'm talking about things that become a chronic condition, a chronic habit. So the number one thing that compromises our health pretty much worldwide right now is stress. And when I use the word stress, I use it pretty broadly. I basically use it to say it's a compromise of our sense of emotional well-being. And so that can include anxiety, that can include, first of all, what we just usually call stress, which means, I'm just stressed. I'm really, it's sometimes just having too much on our plate, spending too much time online, worrying about things too much. We are in this stressed state. There's cortisone that's released into the system, or cortisol, and that is a stress response, and that just wreaks havoc on the body, because the body feels a threat and it prepares for danger and it prepares to fight this off. And if we're in that kind of state chronically, then it has all kinds of negative health effects. So please never underestimate the potential role of stress in whatever physical conditions that you're dealing with. So anxiety, fear, depression, apprehension, worry, loneliness, a lack of purpose, a sense of isolation, vigilance against real and perceived danger, never feeling safe. Those all are what I would call stress, and all of those have a very negative effect on the body. A lot of reasons for that, as we know, in modern living: economic insecurity, disconnection from nature, disconnection from meaningful relationships, feeling a lack of community, feeling a lack of personal relevance in the world, guilt. It's kind of endless. This affects the autonomic nervous system, sends messages to the adrenals to produce cortisone and adrenaline. On the short term, it can create nausea and digestive dysfunction and sweating and all kinds of things. Long term, immune dysfunction, autoimmune conditions and suppressed immunity, which can leave you vulnerable to disease, insomnia, hormone dysfunction, ulcers, increase in the aging process. It's also a major contributing factor to things like heart disease and cancer. So resolving sources of stress, physical stress, emotional trauma, emotional blockages, internalized negative assumptions about yourself or about your life, just those things. I mean, that's a lot, but you just take a single one, and say, okay, well, I'm gonna work on having less stress in my life. What does that look like? Well, that looks like, instead of hopping on the internet and reading the news when I get home from work or when I get up in the morning, I'm not going to do that. And notice how you feel after not doing that for a couple of days and doing something that's more kind of compassionate and loving towards yourself, and something that's more life-enhancing. Sometimes it's really, it's not the big giant things. It's really some of the smaller things that can make a significant difference in reducing stress. Medical and psychological literature is full of stories now about how heart disease, cancer, and other kinds of illnesses have been alleviated, just have been done with as a result of the alleviation of stress and of emotional healing. Of course, it should be, I also want to point out here that emotional symptoms are not always emotionally based. This is a really important point, and this is something that when I was suffering from Lyme and several other tick-borne illnesses, the thing that really got my attention in that is that I was starting to feel crazy. You know, I started to develop this temper, which I never had before. I couldn't think straight. I just was like feeling incredibly negative all the time. And it's like, good God, you know, what is going on? And what I didn't realize was that I had a serious case of neurological Lyme disease and 3 other tick-borne diseases, and my hormones were completely off. You know, I was a basket case physically, and I didn't know it. But what I was experiencing was the emotional manifestations of that. So emotional symptoms, what we experience as emotional symptoms, the ones that I outlined before, including feelings of stress and depression and loneliness and, you know, just being blah and negative, et cetera, can be entirely based on physical factors, physical root causes like hormone dysfunction, mold toxicity, Lyme, and other tick-borne diseases, particularly Babesia, Bartonella, heavy metal toxicity such as mercury, aluminum, copper, and lead, food sensitivities, histamine, what's called histamine sensitivity, which is kind of the new food sensitivity thing out there, and it's very, very important. It's rampant. Most of us don't even know about it. Sleep apnea, which creates a lack of oxygen at night, and when that becomes chronic can have profound emotional effects. Candida overgrowth, Herxheimer reactions, detox reactions, pretty much anything that creates a strong inflammatory response in the body and in the brain, and which sends this cascade of hormonal and neurotransmitter dysfunction. It's going to affect our emotional state and our entire view of the world. So I wanted to point that out because it's really easy in being sick, especially if one is chronically ill, has been dealing with this for a long time, to have a lot of self-judgment and to be feeling like, you know, why can't I get it together? Why am I so negative? And just please know that it may very well be that the things that are going on with you physically can be having a tremendous effect on what you're experiencing as your emotions and as your view of the world. It took me a long time to accept that, you know, because I didn't want to accept that my mind could actually, or my body, my physiology could actually affect my worldview. You know, like my whole view of the world could be affected by just molecules. And I'm sorry, but that's the case. If your hormones are whacked out, if you've got mold toxicity, if your brain's full of spirochetes, you're not going to be a happy camper. There's just no way. But the good news is that once you have those things diagnosed and you start taking care of them, then your emotional life can start to feel really rich and wonderful again, pretty quickly, actually. So the other thing about, one thing I like to counsel when sometimes I work with people who have a lot of physical conditions, and how to get their mind and spirit on board in the healing process, and also sometimes of helping them to figure out what's going on physically. And one of the things, you know, it's easier said than done, but one of the things is to try to not identify with the symptoms that you have. In other words, it's really easy, especially if one has been sick for a long time, to start to identify with being a cancer victim or a Lyme sufferer or something, and the mind has this hunger to establish, the mind, the ego has a hunger to establish an identity and to kind of wrap itself around an identity. It's like it's so desperate to say, okay, I'm a Lyme sufferer, that's what I am, and all of these kind of habitual thoughts start to form around the identity of being a Lyme sufferer, and suddenly you start to view the world from those particular lenses. And unfortunately, what happens is that, going back to the placebo response, where you're having a positive expectancy of an outcome, but there's also something called the nocebo response. And the nocebo response is where the negative expectation creates negative physical effects. So the shadow side of identifying with a diagnosis, I'm not talking about, that you should ignore the diagnosis, but the shadow side of identifying with a particular illness or condition is that it tells the mind, hey, I'm sick. I'm a sick person. And in subtle and dramatic ways, it affects one physiologically. It starts to, there's a tendency of the mind to start to look at, us versus them. They're not Lyme sufferers, I am. They're different from me. And it just sets up this whole process that I found, at least in my own healing process, and my wife also, who suffered from Lyme disease, in a very dramatic way, that it wasn't helpful. It's very seductive. There can be a sense of comfort to it, but it's not helpful. Okay, so let's go. That's why the power of the story that we tell ourselves is so important. And when I mean story, I'm using that word just a little bit loosely because it's not this long internal dialogue, but it is a way that language is internalized to describe a condition or a state that we identify with. So in other words, there's really a choice. One can say, okay, I have Lyme disease, or I have cancer, and I'm not particularly happy about that, but I believe in the power of the mind and spirit and the body to heal, and I'm on board with that, versus a negative story would be, oh my God, life sucks. I mean, and yeah, the microbes are just out to get us, and I kind of deserve this. I brought this on myself because I was so stressed out, and or it's my karma, or I'm creating my own reality here, or it's because I'm weak, or there's no hope, and my doctor tells me it's just never going to change, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a story. That's a story, an inner dialogue, short or long. It tends to build on itself, that is created and that's reinforced. That has nothing to do with the illness. It is it's a conceptual response that we're having to it. It's a creation of the mind. It's a fiction of the mind that says all of these things. I deserve this. This is going to go on forever. And hey, I've been there, I know, and especially with some of these illnesses like Lyme that do affect Bartonella, other tick-borne diseases, it can feel like one has been sick forever and one is going to be sick forever. It seems endless in its source and in its destination. But if you can keep a part of the mind aware, self-aware, to where you can observe the mind, then the mind is always producing stuff. It's always producing a lot of its junk. It's just what the mind does. The mind is a thought-making machine. The philosopher Krishnamurti had a great saying when he said, thought is the thinker. We're not thinking our thought. We're not like creating our thoughts. Thought thinks itself. It's a function of the brain. That's something that Buddhist teachers talk about quite a bit, and other spiritual teachers. So there's no blame in having those thoughts, but if you can learn through a little bit of mind training, to just observe. It's like, oh, there's those negative statements again. There's that negative story again. It gradually will lose its power, and it will let go. Story is so powerful because it provides a context for our experience. It actually helps to establish the range of causes and outcomes. It establishes our field of view and what we consider to be possible. So there can be an innocence to it because it just seems like we're complaining to ourselves. But if we do that habitually, then it kind of creates this construction of what is possible, what's not possible, how we're stuck, and we're kind of creating a cage, innocently creating a cage of our own construction, of our own making. And that's the case because we are wired to story. We are story-making creatures. We understand things in terms of story. So story defines and limits, or it opens us up, depending on the nature of the story. It activates latent positive or negative emotional energies and their consequent physical effects. So that's a point I want to make again, that the power of story is such that it conjures up these emotions, it activates these emotions, and the emotions, as we talked about before, the emotions have this power to affect us physiologically in either in either a positive or a negative way. So let's talk about a positive story. There's one, I kind of came up with this idea called the hero's journey of healing as a result of my own adventure with Lyme disease. And that came about because I was going through a lot of what I was just talking about, of just feeling really sorry for myself, of feeling like a victim, of feeling like life was really against me, of feeling like this condition was never going to end. I couldn't imagine my life without it, et cetera, et cetera. And at some point, and prayer was actually part of this because I was kind of desperate. And it wasn't, sometimes it was prayer to God, sometimes it was to Yeshua, sometimes it was just to the nameless power of creation and intelligence and love. And I asked for help. And what started to come forth was, basically, it was almost like an inner voice that was saying, dude, you're a filmmaker. You've been making films, stories about other people, documentary films and their challenges and what they've overcome. So how about turning the camera on yourself, metaphorically speaking? How about thinking in terms of your own story? What would it look like? What kind of story would you want told if somebody was making a film on your life? And so I started to think in terms of the kinds of films that I made about other people. And also what came forth was the notion of the hero's journey. I love that book by Joseph Campbell, and it had a tremendous effect on me. And it's like, oh my God, what I'm experiencing, when you look at the hero tales throughout time, they're all about people who are undergoing tremendous ordeals. And they don't invite these ordeals. Well, sometimes they do, but a lot of times they don't invite these ordeals. These ordeals are foisted upon them. They may be the result of things that they have invited in one way or the other. And then there's a choice. So the person who's undergoing that kind of suffering and those challenges that are seemingly beyond their ability to deal with them is given a choice of just to cave in and just to give up, and or to venture forth. And sometimes it's a combination of both. Sometimes one gives up, and then at some point you go, hey, wait a minute, this is not the way that I want to do this. And the hero's myth or the hero's journey stories are full of individuals, women and men, who have undergone trials and have found the resources within themselves and outside of themselves in the form of allies and helpers, in the form of inner allies and sources of guidance, in the form of their own innate capacities that they didn't know about. So what I realized was that as I identified more with the hero's journey story, then all of this sense of greater well-being started to happen. So that's what I'm encouraging for you, that for those of you who are really feeling stuck and identified with whatever health challenges that you're dealing with, to consider the possibility that you're on a hero's journey, or that you can start to relate to your difficulties as a hero's journey. And all I can tell you is that it changes everything, because we are wired towards the hero's journey story. It is part, and by hero I mean hero and heroine. I don't identify hero as being male, necessarily. It's a hero is a woman, a hero is a man. But we are wired to that. I have been in different cultures, filming around the world, and whether I was in Alaska or whether I was in the Sahara Desert or wherever, people were telling stories that were hero's journey stories. And so my suggestion is, why not make use of it? Let me look at my notes here for a second, make sure I'm not missing anything. So yeah, physical challenges are seen in the context of a hero's journey. Challenges are regarded as similar to what all admired heroes have gone through throughout time, throughout human history. So it means you're not alone, that you're part of a lineage of heroes, that physical symptoms can be viewed as opportunities to learn through the fire of transformation. And what happens is that when you start to consider that there's some meaning in this journey of healing, in this journey of suffering and this journey of healing, then archetypal energies, these innate universal energies, start to get activated within your psyche. And when that happens, that kicks in the endorphins, that kicks in all of these other hormones and neurotransmitters that are associated with the healing response, and the healing will commence to a much greater degree than before. We said that was my experience and the experience of many people that I know. So it provides the psychic and emotional energy to change old habits of mind and also lifestyle, because that's always a big teaching. It's like, looking at diet, looking at all these other kinds of factors, activating a belief in a larger purpose to your suffering, so it's not futile, it's not meaningless, it's something that can be learned from. And then the fruits can be shared with others, because that's usually part of the hero's journey story as well. That the hero comes back from her journey, she has been transformed, she's overcome these difficulties or these challenges, she's met the challenges, she's learned from them, and now she wants to share the boon or the gift with other people. And that doesn't mean that it has to be in some big dramatic way. It can be in a small way. And if you learn and heal and grow from the illness that you're being challenged with, that means that you will have the capacity, a greater capacity, to be able to help other people that you encounter who are going through the same thing. And that's a great gift. That's a great feeling. So the first thing to activate the hero's journey of healing is to change the context of your experience. And one way to do that is to find a hero that you admire, and that who you feel inspired by, who has overcome suffering in their own life, and allow yourself to identify with them. And we'll talk about this a little bit more, towards the end when we're talking about self-hypnosis. that is basically where you're really deeply internalizing these, again, kind of archetypal universal stories that has a particular subject, which is this particular hero, but they are following the archetypal story, which means that if you identify with them, if you take them on as your own, if you feel them in your body, then they're going to be activated, and all the goodness of healing, will follow, will be part of that. So I just want to stress that this is not, let me scroll up here again. This is not denial. This isn't, positive thinking, glossing over fuzzy New Age stuff. This isn't just going around saying, oh, I'm fine, I'm fine. It isn't denying the suffering that you're going through. It's just not identifying with it and limiting yourself to the suffering, but seeing the suffering in a larger context of something like the hero's journey and saying, wow, God. And when you're part of the hero's journey, when you're identified with the hero's journey, it takes away a lot of the loneliness and the sense of isolation, because you're not alone. You know that there's all these other people who are suffering from Lyme disease, and there's all these people who have, throughout human history, who have suffered from illness and yet have accomplished these great things, or have come to these great understandings, or have developed this great compassion. Just think about the people who, maybe some people that who have gone through cancer. And whether they survived it or not. And perhaps of people who have gone through that and have said, my God, there was a tremendous gift in this. I mean, I've had people who had cancer who said it's the greatest thing that ever happened to me, because I finally slowed down. I finally started to spend some more time with my kids. I finally realized that I was loved for who I was. It's like, in other words, all of these transformations happened as a result of the intensity of that experience. So let's talk a little bit about spiritual healing. And by spiritual healing, or the role of the spiritual in healing, I'm talking about a belief in a benevolent higher power is one form of it. Another is belief in unseen energies and personages who one can interact with for healing and insight and learning of healthier ways of being and living. And another aspect of spirituality often is prayer, is engaging in prayer, which is sometimes it's an asking or a begging for some sort of benefit, physical, material, or psychological, mental, emotional benefit. And other times it's just a sense of communing with a mystery that is greater than oneself. So all of those have very positive aspects in terms of healing. So inner personages, of course, can include God, Jesus, Green Tara, Shiva, Saint Michael. Goes on and on and on, depending on what culture, what spiritual tradition that you identify with. Another is more shamanic, is the use of the meeting with animal allies and personages, such as in the Navajo tradition, or what are called Yebiche, or the holy ones. Another is personal healing guides, inner healing guides, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Reiki guides. One of the things that I did as part of my healing process from Lyme was that I became a Reiki master, and wow, that made a big difference. When I studied at that level and was kind of running those energies through my own body at that level, that was also part of really turning the tide in terms of my own healing from Lyme disease. And other Another thing that some people do is to relate with benevolent ancestors. There some dear grandmother or aunt or somebody who has passed on that they still feel a very strong connection with. Now, there's also negative spiritual aspects that can have an influence on physical health. One of them is what are called disembodied entities. Now, I want to kind of preface this by saying that when I studied depth hypnosis, the Depth Hypnosis Institute is very integrative, and there was a lot of incorporation and appreciation for things like shamanism, Buddhist psychology, and we also read some of the literature that were written by PhDs, clinical psychologists, psychiatrists, people who came from that portion of the brain that really believes in things needing to be seen and things needing to be repeated in order for them to exist. And yet these particular individuals who became clinical, either psychiatrists or clinical psychologists, started to encounter things within their practice that they had no explanation for, and when they started reading more broadly outside of just the psychiatric or the psychological literature, they started to see mention of things like entities, and through their own research and experimenting, they came to appreciate them as something that was very real. So disembodied entities are my understanding, I'm not an expert in this, but my understanding is that they're the spirits who have been in human form and who have died but are stuck in between realms. Sometimes we call them ghosts. And there's also dark energies, and these are entities who have never taken human form and have always been kind of part of the darkness side of the yin-yang equation of existence. There's also past life imprints. And it's been really interesting for me because I've been pretty open spiritually because I've had to be because of certain experiences that I've had. But I've also been pretty skeptical. And I was really skeptical about this thing of entities until a few experiences that I had. And then of reading this literature that's pretty, dense and pretty extraordinarily presented by these PhDs and MDs, and they're going, look, I don't like believing in this stuff either, but I can't ignore the evidence. And all I know is that when I relate to these, when I recognize them for what they're presenting themselves as entities, for instance, or past life imprints, and I work with them in this certain way, my patients enjoy relief that they've never had from anything else that they've tried. So this goes for both psychological healing and physical healing. Some of the people that have written about this, Edith Fiore is one. Dr. Winifred Blake Lucas has written a couple of really fascinating books. They're kind of more for practitioners. Dr. Tom Zinser is somebody who is a clinical psychologist and was working with people who had multiple personalities. And he, through kind of an interesting process, came about to receive information about the role of entities, and he just tried it out in his practice. And these people who had tried psychiatric medications and all this therapy, including his therapy, and were not having any luck, they were getting this tremendous relief. And so he kind of said the same thing. He said, well, let's look at the evidence, let's look at the outcome, and if this is what it is, then fine with me. So I'm just mentioning those things, meaning that physical conditions, so just to kind of recap in a way, physical conditions can have a strong psychological, emotional component to them. They can be the result of repressed trauma, emotional blockages, habitual negative states of mind, and I'm adding to it by saying negative entities is another possibility, and that when those things are addressed, there can be dramatic physical healings as a result. It certainly doesn't hurt. If we had more time, I could tell you this great story about this guy who ran a trading post in Navajo country, who was a devout Christian and who contacted me because he had been a total skeptic and totally judgmental about his Navajo weavers, who are very religious in the Navajo way. And then he had his own experience of disembodied entities, and it was very humbling, but maybe another time. So how to work spiritually with bringing healing into your life. As I mentioned before, sometimes it's working with a particular entity. So it's entity, I mean like a deity. Like if you believe in God, if you believe in Jesus, and Jesus was a great healer. If you believe in green Tara, or you believe in, whatever it is, if there's within your spiritual tradition, if there are personages who were known for healing and known for their love and their compassion for humankind, then you can go in and you can make contact with them and you can ask them for help and just put yourself in a very open and relaxed and receptive state to receive that energy. And it can have a very positive, very, very positive effect. Another thing would be to work with somebody who is experienced with entity release if you suspect that there is just something that's been kind of dogging you, that one of the symptoms can be a very, very fast onset of symptoms, emotional symptoms, physical symptoms that don't seem to have a particular cause to them. And prayer has been proven to be very, very powerful. You don't even need to be religious to pray. It's more a communing. You can be an atheist if you believe in some vast source, not a deity, but a source of the animating source of existence, something that propels life into evolution, etc., then there's a way of communing with that, opening your mind and just communing silently with that. And that can be very healing. So let's talk about hypnosis. Hypnosis first came about, or I should say that the early uses of hypnosis had nothing to do with stage hypnotism, making people cluck like a chicken. It was actually, one of the pioneers was a man named Esdale, James Esdale, who was a Scottish surgeon in India, and he didn't have anesthesia. And he had to like amputate people's legs. And so he found that using a very deep form of hypnosis, taking people into a very deep hypnotic trance, he could do 80% of what hypnosis could do 80% of what anesthesia could do. And so he was able to, and not only that, but people who underwent surgery, if they did have anesthesia back then, still died like flies, and his patients did not. So there was something about the activation of the immune system, etc., as a result of this deep hypnosis that also gave his clients a much better chance of living. Excuse me. Hypnosis was also used early on in dentistry, and so it was recognized very early for pain relief. What is hypnosis? We don't really know. We know that it's a natural capacity of the conscious mind to relax, while the subconscious mind becomes, in a sense, closer to the surface or more accessible, so that it can be worked with, it can be dialogued with for the purpose of relaxation, for the purpose of insight, and for the purpose of healing, both emotional and physical healing. Characteristics, we've all experienced versions of hypnosis. Deep relaxation. Sometimes it's like that almost dream state when you first wake up and you're awake, but you're still kind of in that dream state. Well, that's very much what a hypnotic state feels like. It's a focused but relaxed awareness. There's often, as I said, deeply relaxing on every level, physiological level of the body. There's also a what's called suggestibility, which means a certain way in which the mind can receive an instruction and those instructions get passed at a very deep level into the subconscious mind. So that brings forth potential misconceptions about hypnosis, and meaning, you know, you'll cluck like a chicken, you'll bark like a dog, you'll lose control, lose your mind, you get stuck in a trance, you'll do things against your will, you'll be taken over by the devil, but none of those things are true. People who go and do ridiculous things in front of stage hypnotists, excuse me, tend to be exhibitionists. They're chosen very carefully for a variety of reasons because they are willing to do ridiculous things, and they also tend to be people who are very fearful or don't want to embarrass the hypnotist, so they'll go ahead and follow along with the instructions. I've talked to people who have done that. Well, I didn't want to hurt his feelings. You won't lose control of your mind. You won't reveal your innermost secrets. You're actually conscious. You're very, very deeply relaxed, but you're still conscious in the state of hypnosis, and which means that you can emerge from that state anytime you want. You can say, I've had enough, and you can come out of it anytime you want. But a lot of people don't want to, and they don't want to because it is so deliciously, extraordinarily relaxing. It's like in a sense, it feels like some of the deep, deep forms of meditation. And so the only time I've had a client who it was, you know, it took a little time for them to get out, it's because they didn't want to come out. They loved where they were, and they didn't want to face the rest of the day. So you don't have to worry about getting stuck in it. You won't do anything against your will because your faculties are still there. And likewise, if you are working with a hypnotist or hypnotherapist and you're receiving suggestions from them towards healing, emotional healing, physical healing, whatever, they can't tell you anything that if you disagree with will take effect. So in other words, if you're working with somebody and they say something as a suggestion and you're going, well, no, I don't want to do that, or that's not the way I would put it at all, it's not going to take hold. You know, it's not like some magical programming that goes into the computer of your brain and then you don't have a choice about it. So it's very, very benign. Now, the only time that it's really contraindicated is if a person is schizophrenic, has multiple personalities, is in the midst of of alcohol or drug psychosis, something like that. Not to say that there aren't people who can't work with schizophrenics or people with multiple personality disorders, but it takes somebody who's extraordinarily adept, because those are so, you know, basically if you're a basic sound mind, then hypnosis is fine. Hypnosis is very safe. It's been practiced for a long time. And to make sure, of course, that the person that you're working with is qualified and that you feel a good connection, a feeling of trust with them. That's very important. So hypnosis for health. The alleviation of mental emotional conditions such as stress, fears, anxiety, difficult habits, negative internalized stories. There's a deep response of the body and the mind in terms of relaxation. It activates the vagus nerve. And then you can introduce instructions to the subconscious mind which will affect the autonomic nervous system. So we can actually have an effect in alleviating hypertension, stress, constipation, high blood pressure. There can be a benefit in working with cancer, pain management, autoimmune conditions, childbirth. It can help people to stop smoking or overeating or overdrinking. It can be really useful in helping to fight diseases because it can help to activate the immune system. Pre-op and post-op, you know, before and after surgery. It can help with anxiety. It can reduce the level of anesthesia that's needed, and it can radically speed up the healing process afterwards. I want to just mention something called verbal first aid, which is really a wonderful thing. And that is the use of the voice in emergency kinds of situations that can have a really sometimes very, very dramatic effect on healing. It is something, I forget the name of the person who developed it, but she termed it verbal first aid, which is brilliant. And I encourage everybody to get the book that she's written, which is called Verbal First Aid, because it'll teach you about what to do if you're in a situation and you come across a car accident, or if you're a medical professional, or you work in an ambulance, or you're a first responder, or something like that. There's a way that you can use your words that can have a profound effect on a person. And I'll just give a tiny example of this. I had a neighbor show up to my place, and he had really severe second degree and almost third degree burns on his hand and on his forearm and on his stomach. And he was in a tremendous amount of pain, and he was shaking. And my wife was there, and she gave him some homeopathy for the anxiety. But he was very freaked out. He was very worried. He was in terrible judgment about himself because it was kind of a silly accident that he had with his stove. And I drove him to the hospital, which was an hour away. And because I knew a little bit about verbal first aid, I just started talking in this. I asked his permission first, and then I started talking in this calm voice, and I just said, John, it's really wonderful, all the stories that are out there about people who have healed their body with their minds. And just by thinking about how the body is able to start to heal itself, how it wants to heal itself, how it starts to heal itself even before we ask it to, even without us asking it to. But just think about what the possibilities are when we do ask it to. So, I was kind of talking in this slightly hypnotic way and introducing these suggestions, these ideas of the body being able to heal, of his body being able to heal, about how by focusing on something out in the landscape as we were driving by, that he could focus on that and the pain would gradually reduce. And he went from this real, just in terrible pain and anxiety and almost a panic attack to being calm. And we walked into the emergency room, and he went up and he sat down and he went, okay, so what are we going to do now, to the reception person. And she kind of looked at him and his hand and went, are you okay? And he said, well, I'm a lot better than I was. Let's get this over with. And he healed in a remarkable amount of time and had no scarring. So the wonder of this isn't what I did, it's that I said a few words and activated what was latent in his own mind. And so this can work if your child cuts them, or your partner cuts themselves, or whatever, that there's words that you can say. Conversely, if you say, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, this is terrible, that is going to activate their stress response and can have exactly the opposite, a negative effect on their healing. But if you work in terms of this verbal first aid, these calming words and this acknowledgement of the body's capacity to heal, and you're introducing those words specifically towards what they're dealing with there, it can have this remarkable effect. So I really encourage you to get that book. So we're getting along here in time, and so I want to go ahead to self-hypnosis. And the first thing I want to do is I want to recommend another book. And this is it right here. So this is Guided Imagery for Self-Healing. Guided Imagery for Self-Healing by Martin Rossman, Rossman, MD. Hope you can see that there. Not sure where it needs to be. Okay. I've got a lot of books on self-hypnosis, and this is just one of the finest. He has done it for decades. He's very humble. He's had tremendous results, and it's really designed for for any of us to be able to read and to start to apply towards our own life. So I want to talk about self-hypnosis, and it's basically using this latent capacity of your mind towards the process of your own healing. And so here's some steps to that. So the first thing is to adopt the right attitude, and that's this attitude of positive expectancy and of having this positive anticipation of what the possibilities of this activity are in your life. So that's kind of like hope, you know, having some hope, open-mindedness. So an attitude of allowing that you're going to, in this session with yourself, you're going to allow relaxation and peace and insight and healing to emerge on its own, in its own form, in its own time, trusting your subconscious mind, trusting its wisdom, trusting your body that it has this remarkable capacity to heal, and placing yourself in a comfortable, safe place. The phones are off, your iPhone's off, your a sign's on the door, please don't disturb. You don't want to be interrupted. It's not dangerous to be interrupted when you're in a hypnotic state. It's just unpleasant because it's such a delicious state. You know, it's like it's like having a wonderful meal. You don't want to like get up in the middle of it. So you can sit, you can recline, you can lay down, although laying down you're likely to fall asleep. Wear loose clothing, take off jewelry, anything that's tight, anything that's constricting, and then take some deep, gentle breaths. And do the breathing from your belly. In yoga, sometimes it's called belly breathing, or it's called Buddha breathing. And it's by relaxing the muscles of your diaphragm and the muscles of your abdomen and allowing your stomach, when you inhale, your stomach will kind of puff out, and allowing your stomach to expand and contract with your breath. And what this does is it activates the vagus nerve, among other things, and sets forth this cascade of these relaxation neurotransmitters and hormones, and kind of, you know, lays the groundwork. So that's a really good way to start. And some people, it's funny, are, even if they're by themselves, are self-conscious, like, my belly looks so big. But go ahead, just let your belly be big, because it feels really good when your abdominal muscles are really relaxed, and you're taking in these comfortable deep breaths. Now I'm not going to go into detail about the different techniques of self-hypnosis because there's a lot of sources. It really depends on what works for you, but I just want to say that it may take some experimentation. One thing that works for one person won't necessarily work for another. Another thing is to be conscious of whether you are a visual person, whether you're a tactile person, whether you are you say are not visual but you really respond strongly to sound, or whether you just have feelings, you know, whether you sense things by feelings more than anything else, because whatever your dominant sense mechanism is the one that you should focus on with your self-hypnosis. So if you're visually oriented, then you can imagine yourself in this beautiful garden, and you can bring forth all these different things of beauty in this garden. If you're smell-oriented, then you would place yourself, say, in a relaxing garden, but you would have the sense of smell. There'd be all these beautiful flowers, or the smell of the water flowing through the creek, or the scent of the pines coming down from the mountains, et cetera, et cetera. So one technique for actually, what you're doing is you're kind of shifting the mind's focus from the conscious thought process to this much more relaxed and focused and inward focus. And there's different ways of doing that. One way is by creating eye strain, and it's by looking at a point on the ceiling. So you're sitting there and your head is forward, but you're looking up at a point on the ceiling that is just right at your at the top of your line of sight. And it's a little uncomfortable. I mean, what you're doing is you're actually creating strain in the eyes. But you do that, you focus on that spot. You don't kind of wander around. You focus on that spot, focus on that spot, focus on that spot. You've already done your belly breathing, and you kind of continue a relaxed breathing. You focus on that spot, and when your eyes get really tired, then you allow your eyes to drop down, and your head can drop down, and you imagine yourself and your consciousness just kind of going down, 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 inward, inward, inward. Now, some people, this is all that it takes, and they can go very deep. So as I said, it's for some it'll work brilliantly. For others, it won't. Don't judge yourselves. It's like a mind training too, so it takes some time. Sometimes immediate, sometimes it takes some time. So I just encourage you to persist with it because the benefits are so great. Another way is to have your arm lifted, your hand, and to focus on a spot on your hand, and just to consciously relax, and you focus on that spot on your hand, focusing on that spot on your hand, and then shift your focus to the tip of your nose, and that's creating some eye strain there. And then when you feel that strain and there's kind of a heaviness in the eyes, then you can focus back on your hand and then allow your hand to drop. And as your hand drops, then you drop your eyes. You may drop your head. And you just have this sense of this kind of cascading of muscles relaxing and taking you down and down and in. And it's not as if you're aiming for some profound trance state where the rest of the world just disappears. It'll be a focused, deeply relaxed, calm state that has this feeling of openness to it, openness and possibility. And then what you can do from there is that you can start to you can apply it for the purpose of healing. One other thing I want to mention, another way of doing it, and it's something that Martin Rossman talks about in the books, is that you can look at a self-hypnosis script and you can record it, and you can take that recording in, and you can put yourself in a safe place, put some earbuds in, and then just allow yourself to be taken on this journey. You can record the voice yourself. You can have, if you don't like your voice for some reason, you can have somebody else record it, whose voice you like, and that's another way of doing it. And there's lots of scripts in that book for different ways of healing and meeting inner guides, etc., or you can design it yourself. In designing a session for yourself, it's like you're gathering ingredients, and you're gathering ingredients of the kinds of images and past experiences and spiritual personages or personages in real life who you really admire, who have certain kinds of qualities. These ingredients that have a emotional potency to them. So you're looking for something that you really resonate with, somebody who you really love and admire, or an inner spiritual figure who you really feel a great love and devotion and benevolence from. Another thing is to gather images that are around say the condition that you're trying to heal. And okay, let me get back on excuse me here. Okay, so inner personages. Also, really conjure up vivid states of wellness that you have experienced in the past. Or say if you've had some kind of healing in the past, what that felt like, and imagining that so in other words, you're gathering potent, emotionally potent ingredients, personages or that you admire and love, who have these qualities that you want to emulate, or who had experiences of healing, your own past vivid states of healing, experiences with healing, so that these are the things that you're kind of stringing together. These are the things that you're going to introduce, that you're going to visualize, that you're going to feel into when you are in that deeply relaxed state. So one way to apply this is if you are dealing with a particular physical condition, the simplest thing that you can do is just that you take yourself through this process of deep relaxation into this deeply relaxed state, and then you just call forth this this feeling of wellness. You're recalling, even, it doesn't matter how bad you feel in the moment. This is the beauty of it. If you can recall that feeling, that wonderful feeling of wellness and wholeness that you have had in the past, then the subconscious mind remembers that. And it doesn't know the difference between past and present and future. You know, it's all the now to the subconscious mind. So by embodying that and really taking in that feeling of that past experience as the present, then the subconscious relates to it as the present and starts to make the physiological changes in the body to accommodate that state of wellness. So in that way, you know, that's just very simple, and that can be done in a fairly short period of time. And that's kind of a nice way to get to know self-hypnosis, is to do that. You can also call forth that inner spiritual personage, be it God or Jesus or Buddha or whoever, and just imagining that being in front of you, with you, loving you, sending you love and compassion, and that energy and that love and compassion and that healing flowing into your body is another thing that you can do. Again, very, very simple. But when you're in that deeply relaxed and receptive state, it can feel very powerful. So, and then from there you can go into more complex forms of self-hypnosis, where if you're dealing with something like Lyme disease, or say with cancer, where say with cancer, well, you've got these things called out of control cells, and the cells are multiplying, and they're potentially spreading in other parts of your body. And so the thing to do is to come up with your own images of how you relate to that. So you have to know a little bit about the physiological process that's going on. What is the cancer doing in your body? And then you come up with your own metaphors for your own kind of images, your own metaphors for those processes. So if it's a mass of cells in a tumor, you come up with your own image of what that mass of cells as in the tumor look like, what a meaningful metaphor. You know, some people might say, well, it's a bunch of maggots, or some people might say it's a bunch of cells that are just lost. They're like lost little children grouped together. And somebody else could say, well, it's just like a bunch of angry bees. So, you know, come up with an image for that. And then if the process of healing entails somehow getting rid of those cells, then come up with your own imagery and metaphors for that process of getting rid of the cells. No size, you know, no one size fits all. So for some people, it's going to be waging a war, you know, and having soldiers, and they're marching in, and they're killing these angry destructive cancer cells. For somebody else, it's coming in and covering them with light and dissolving them into light, you know, because the war imagery is just not their style at all. So you find something that you feel a deep resonance with, and then you take yourself into that deeply relaxed state. You imagine that process going on, the eradication or the transformation of those cancer cells, and you do it on as consistent a basis as you can. And it can be a tremendous, tremendous benefit for you. So you can do this for any physiological condition. If you have some kind of hormone dysfunction, learn just a little bit about the organ that produces the hormone and the physiological processes, nothing really complicated. And then come up with it's like you're telling a story in a way, you know, and you come up with your own images. It's fun. It's really cool, because you're kind of creating this whole other depth of relationship with your inner life and with your body in a very compassionate and loving way. You can also, and there's something that Dr. Rossman talks about a lot in his book is to meet with an inner guide of some kind and ask the inner guide for guidance. Ask them what's going on with your body, what changes or what do you need to do, what is your body asking of you. And it can be the source of some really very profound and useful information. If doubt or fear arises, you can just acknowledge it. If, say, doubt arises in the middle of this session, you can allow the fear to be there and then call up a feeling of confidence from another time in your life, of certainty, and kind of hold those two feelings together. And it'll help to dissolve that feeling of negativity. It actually restructures the memories that come from, that are the root source of that doubt. If it's a habitual doubt, it actually reconfigures how those memories are stored in the brain. Now, I just want to stress that just the activity of putting yourself into this deeply relaxed state on a consistent basis has tremendously beneficial effects, because when the body reaches that deep physiological relaxation, the healing process commences. It's like it's a signal to the body that says, great, the war is over, let's get to work. And so all these wonderful healing processes start. How can you apply this with spooky? And one way is that whatever frequencies that you're using, and you know, whatever mode you're using, whether it's ultrasonic or whether it's plasma or whether it's contact or whether it's remote, of taking yourself into that state and of receiving those frequencies. If you're using the plasma tube, you know, you can imagine that light and that energy penetrating into the area that you want to receive that healing, and of it doing its wonderful work, and of those frequencies. And you can visualize the frequencies in some other way. They're not, of course, you know, we plug in these numbers or we click on these numbers, but you can visualize the frequency in whatever way is meaningful for you. And then by creating a meaningful metaphor, it activates the archetype, if you will, of that frequency, and it will do its work on a whole other level. So looks like we've gone a while here, and so I'm going to pause. Oh, one thing I want to stress is that if you, in terms of really deep emotional work, I really recommend working with a compassionate and skilled practitioner for that, and not doing that work on your own. Because when you're working with a competent and compassionate guide, that has its own form of healing, and it's going to be a much more efficient way of working. So I'm looking to see if there's any questions. I certainly welcome your questions. Can I supply, Wolfgang Janata asked, can I supply a written version of my talk, of my most excellent talk? Well, thank you, Wolfgang. That's a good question. I don't know. I'll look into that. Bev Wright asked, she says, hi Kevin, I use the twin lasers as a pendulum to increase and shift energy. I also use Spooky with sacred geometry, sensor rings, and crystals. Have you tried these? If so, what results have you had? Thanks, Bev. Thank you, Bev, for the question. No, I have not used pendulum. Now, I have used a pendulum for guidance sometimes, but I have not used it to shift energy. And I haven't used these other things. So wow, that's wonderful. Good work. Thank you for the question. And Diana Smith asked, can I put the names of the books that I recommend in chat so I can find them after the session is over? And if I can do that afterwards, I will. So any other questions? Let's see. It looks like, I think that's all the questions. Okay. All right. So this has been a long session. I talked a lot. I apologize. I hope it was interesting and useful. And if questions come to you afterwards, feel free to contact me through my website, inneralliance.net.
Thank you. Thank you, Kevin, for taking time out from your busy schedule to be on our show. We've all benefited from your fascinating talk. This was your first time being on a streaming video live on the internet, and you did great.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you again. Thank you. Now, just a gentle reminder, if anyone else would like to also be on our show, please email us at sammer@spooky2-mall.com. We'd love to hear from you. So thank you once again. Kevin, your talk was brilliant. It was fascinating. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
And thank you, viewers, for watching. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.